Hi, I'm Scott Barry Kaufman from the Imagination Institute. At the Imagination Institute, we're dedicated to making progress on the growth, improvement, and measurement of imagination across all sectors of society. Toward that aim, we've been hosting a series of imagination retreats. These retreats consist of discussions with some of the world's most imaginative thinkers across a wide range of fields, from psychology to comedy to physics to spirituality, among others. We've had a lot of exciting discussions about how imagination operates within each field and how we can help young people develop imagination. We've also been discussing the importance of imagination in society more generally. What you're about to watch is edited footage of one of these imagination retreats. In addition, all the videos and reports of all the retreats will be available on our website at imagination-institute.org. I'm going to throw something a bit controversial out here. I'm not convinced that we need religion in the next 500 years. And I'd like to kind of bring that topic up for discussion. You moved it up, and for you, kind of the highest thing would be like positive religion. But why didn't you go like higher to like what I think might be higher? And could be a point of contention. Like positive spirituality, or why do we need identity? And I feel like my whole life has been kind of like I've been becoming more and more real, thinking to myself that identity is overrated. I really think it's overrated. Personally, experience-wise, as a young kid, I was labeled with a learning disability, and that was my identity from my childhood. And I found that to be incredibly limiting. And I wanted to come up with some sort of new theory of intelligence that would expand the number of kids that are mislabeled or falling between the cracks in our education system because of the way that they're pigeonholed, and it's very easy to integrate things into your identity in a way that doesn't allow you to see other perspectives or even allow yourself to see other sides of yourself.
This is where the scholar part of me comes out as a scholar of religion. And it's always helpful for me to remember that the term religion as a descriptor of certain kinds of human behavior did not even exist before the early 19th century. And it was really partly an Enlightenment creation that was a category used to describe all those things that can't be reduced to reason or science. And so I think today, if we get stuck in that Enlightenment view of what religion is, we're stuck with a whole set of assumptions about what everything else is too. And so I often just prefer to not use the term religion, although it's descriptive. It's funny how we create categories and then we live into them, and then suddenly we have things that actually are the religions that were being described. Like there was no such thing, in the 18th century as Buddhism. It just did not exist as a concept. Now, there were Buddhist practices, which we would say all over the world, but it wasn't a religion. So I think that when I use the term, I prefer to use the term spirituality, although I'm still not sure exactly what that marks, but it doesn't bring with it a whole host of assumptions about what it's not. Whereas I think when we say religion, we think, well, of course we need to move beyond religion because the very way it was defined in the first place was the realm of that which was other than what would make us produce progress. That was the very construction of religion itself was configured that way. And it was also a feminized space, It was the space where all the things that women did went. It was about affect. It was about, they're whole loaded up with, assumptions. This is what religion is. What I'm just describing is the way I think when you say, do we need to get beyond religion, how that word functions in our society today. And that's how it got there, and that's what it's become. It means institutions, it means doctrines, it means certain kinds of practices, it means family traditions, it means, and you could go on and on. But it is the realm of also the irrational, that which is beyond the realm of science and reason. Hence, it's always put next to it. So I think we need to get beyond the Enlightenment. In some sense, is the bigger question, or what do we take with us from the Enlightenment as we move forward? Not do we need to get beyond religion, or how are we taking all of this, and what are we bringing out of it?
I'm wondering in the thought experiment if there was a situation where we learned more how to live with others who do have completely different um, core values, completely different beliefs. It's interesting thought experiment. What if we lived in a world where you didn't subscribe to a certain belief system, or that you became more comfortable coexisting in the same space? What do we really gain by saying I am Jewish? What do we really gain by saying I am, as opposed to saying, I have these values and you have these values that are very different? Oh, that's interesting. I can deal with that. I don't need to fight you over it.
I think, when you look at everyday life of a religious person or the people who practice religions or the spirituality, that is me. I cannot distinguish which action of me during the course of the day is religious as opposed to non-religious, or which action is non-spiritual as opposed to spiritual. It's all, woven into together, right? So when we look at our, everyday life, it's like that. But then when you look at organizations, social structures, that's when we talk about, kind of a segregating. Oh, this is religion, which is not the scientific thing or the world, and then so on. But then I think we are, in a way, really living, every day, which is beyond or kind of inside, or I don't know, really fuzzy things about the religion.
To identify as sort of a human, yeah, we're humans, but we need community. And as I understand it, from an evolutionary point of view, our community is 150, 250, or whatever people. That's the community. And religious affiliations, you can be an elk or whatever, but tend to provide a community. That's one thing, and a sense of identity. Okay, this is where I came from. This is my background. It's a start point. The other thing I think that it provides is structure. And it has to do with time and structuring time and how we approach the world. We tend to get caught up in the rush of jobs and family obligations and a whole range of things, and you can just get pushed along by the tide. If you have a structure that says, well, we're going to come together, weekly, or these times are important, and they cause us to think about things. In other words, this is a very artificial gathering, right? It had to be funded by somebody, and it had to be organized, and it's part of a program and a grant and all of that. But the fact is, what we're getting together and doing is talking about things that are important to us and affect our lives. And one of the things that happens Jewishly, for example, but I'm sure it happens in other contexts, is, okay, Friday night your family comes together and gathers around and talks about certain things and relates about certain things. On a Saturday, you go to your synagogue and you don't have somebody giving necessarily a homily. You've got a text that you look at and you discuss, and it's heavily psychological, and you try and figure out how it relates to your life and what lessons, and you discuss it with people afterwards. And there's certain desirable elements to that, regardless of belief. I don't believe in God. The formulation I came up with is, the latest one is, God is like a corporation. It's an artificial being which has perpetual existence and acts through agents.
It's Friday afternoon, about 5 o'clock, about 2.5 hours before I was going to go and speak on a Sabbath eve and try to give some inspiration to an elderly congregation at the time. And I get a call from the security desk saying there's a man downstairs who needs to see you right now. And so I said, okay, well, I'm walking out, but I can see him for a minute. He came upstairs into my office and he was white as a ghost. I'd never met him before. He said, I haven't been to synagogue in about 30 years, but I went to Hebrew school here when I was a child. I'd never met him before. He said, and my daughter committed suicide this morning. His instinct was to go to the synagogue and speak to the rabbi. He wasn't a religious man. I don't even think that he was particularly spiritual. The role that I was playing for him, because he didn't know Darren Levine, and Darren Levine didn't know him, I was facilitating a process for him where he was able to be reminded of something that was valuable in life and a reason why to go on. The way that I interpreted then was he needed a reminder that God loved him. And I was the vessel for that. And that's on some level what religion provides in all different settings. It helps people, in my opinion, to face those moments in their lives where panic about existence emerges and they question the reason why to go on. And theology is that realm, because I'm sitting at this table because I'm interested in PERMA and seeing where the authentic place PERMA can live within religion. Going back to your mental exercise, I'm articulating an idea where PERMA applies in a religious setting. If we don't have application in a religious setting for PERMA, where does PERMA then live in the human institutions that we've created if we no longer have religious institutions?
When we come to difficult situations like death or places of loss, I find myself struggling, but I'm not going to take what I consider the easy route of saying, the Christian answers I was given as a child, because for me that is an easy route. So I will say something like, well, I don't know. I think there's a lot that we don't know in the world. There's a lot in the universe we don't know. And I don't know, but I think the universe is taking care of us. It's unfolding. I mean, if you want to call that God, okay. But if you don't want to, that's okay too. And I think that, these ideas, I don't think we have to have religion to talk about birth and death and all of those other things. I think that our imagination can come up with other ideas. So for me, I'm a little bit jaded. My religious experience was not great. And I don't think that my children suffer for that. I think they are doing very well with the kind of uncertainties that I'm comfortable telling them about. Say, I don't know, but the universe is unfolding for you. You are learning, you are growing. And the place that they come for comfort is home, because we're there and we tell them they matter.
I also keep thinking in this context of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the mid-20th century, who watched Christianity, become co-opted by a fascist state, and was a theologian through and through and a man of the church. And he saw the church that he loved completely discredited. And he didn't see a future for the church, but he talked about religionless Christianity. And the idea behind that was that whatever true insights Christianity brings into the world would outlive the broken institution. And I've actually been thinking about this. I've been in Australia 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure that Australia is a less church-going, less overtly religious nation than the United States, but it has been so refreshing to be in a country where entire cities open their arms to refugees.
And you know, I know this is happening in other places, it's happening in the States and in Canada, but I get this feeling it's more of a national phenomenon here. That's religionless Christianity, not just Christianity, but that is an essence of what religion rose to empower and embolden in human life.
We've been talking a lot about human nature, and we've been talking a lot about this idea that I've been struggling with, which is this evolutionary psychology, where as infants, as we come into this world, we really learn what it means to be in this place through binary. Hot, cold, up, down, day, night, left, right, it just goes on. It's how we almost at a very, again, I'm looking at Roy now and he's working at the self. It's almost how I see the self being formed is through this binary. And happy, sad, the list goes on and on. It's just how we understand, Kahneman's work, well, with 1, 2, I mean, it's just continuing to emerge. And then it's this idea of, if you continue on this binary road with me, this idea of I don't even know who I am until I know what I'm not. What does it mean for me to be a man until I know what I'm not? What does it mean for me to be white? What does it mean for me to be Jewish? The list goes on. And then there's this moment where it's not just I don't know who I am until I know what I'm not, where we then say, who I am is better than what I'm not. Yeah. And I think this is human nature. This is the evolutionary story. And until we begin to kind of wrestle with this, I remember being 12 years old in 8th grade, and I went to a public school, and there was a Catholic school right next to us who had the Easter that week different, so our Easter break was right after Easter, their week break was right before. And we're walking home. We were all Jewish. We're walking home, and there were the kids from the Catholic school, and we got into a fight. Why? Who I am is better than what I'm not. It's just something that we have to wrestle with at a very deep evolutionary level. This is not just education. This is basically how we begin to identify. So when we're talking about self and we're talking about identity, talking about 4th grade, I only know when we're in 4th grade what I'm not. And then later on that, the jocks are better or worse than the nerds. And this is just part of how and again, it's universal because I go to China, it's there as well. This idea of binary, I don't know who I am until I know what I'm not, and who I am is better than what I'm not. So I'll just leave that as, and I think it tethers together with humility because at some point we have to learn to change that mindset.
But it's even larger than identity because culture tells us before we even know who we are, what's on the, I used to do this with my students. I'd just have them list any opposites, all kinds of opposites, and put them on one section of the board and then say, now arrange these into better and worse. And they were unanimous in culturally, not what you think, but culturally. So reason is better than emotion. Male is higher than female. You can just go down. And then the second step that happens is everything in one column gets associated with each other, whereas everything in the other column, like female, emotional, weak, dark, evil, everything in the other column gets associated in a kind of blob. So that you have these two blobs. And then even if your identity culturally is in one blob, you want to really be in the other blob. You aspire to be in the positive one. So there's a strange identity formation that goes about through the cultural way that any given culture will put these two things in the same line, all the better things and all the worse things of the opposites. It's all over the world.
I think what the future holds, if we are going to move forward in such a way that we don't continue to kill each other and be violent and marginalize and hierarchicalize, we have to step into a space where we have a different concept of identity,
Yes.
in which our boundaries that mark who we are become they're permeable. We develop permeable boundaries around ourselves so we learn ways of thinking that don't require that we are this or that. The truth is that we actually know how to move forward. We know a lot. We know how to address poverty. We know what to do about climate change. We know how to develop educational models that address the intransigent racism. It's just it's the will and the heart to do it. And so I've moved away from thinking that future holds some mysterious thing with respect to what I desire the world to look like, in which people flourish and the earth flourishes. But this is where love comes in, is I think that's the part, the love tied to will, the pull towards it is what's missing, which means becoming different kinds of people, continuing our own evolution, but it's evolution of the heart.
And what prevents that, do you think? I think most people would agree with you that we do know. And I think a lot of people would even say we need more love and will. What's the barrier there if we know? What's the barrier, do you think?
I don't actually think we do know, because I don't think we have relationships across those chasms of poverty, wealth, privilege, people who live with this burden of bias. I think that all of our models of economic development and political policies haven't been enough because we don't have this web of human relationships. So we can't actually know we are a room of very privileged, white, mostly Western American people. We cannot know what those people need because that's the dynamic we have. And that's, I think, where love comes into this. I was thinking last night, the word itself is problematic, and we need to use an ecosystem of words, and we need to bring all the fullness of our intelligence, our practical intelligence about love, and use all the words, all the qualities that it has in real life, where it is often not easy. But all of that would go into what would it mean to be in relationship across these human gaps. To me, that is what gets in the way, and that's the missing step. That's what we haven't known how to do and haven't actually put our will behind in all of our advance up to this point.
There are things we don't know. We have 7 billion people now on this planet, and it's because of someone named Haber in about 1905 who figured out how to extract nitrogen from the air to fertilize and make more plants. And we didn't know that. So I also don't want to, I agree about we don't know it on the chasm ground, but there's plenty of science and technology to come which relates to our future.
I would just add to that, we do know a lot, and then there are the things that we have yet to discover. And this part about relationship and love, I think it has not in the past, as we've developed it, and it's been the thing that ought to have been and at times was developed in the religious traditions, the earth itself was not included. It was sort of talking about connections between people, as if that would be the thing that would pull it. And I think when it comes to connecting to the earth and that spirituality, there's so much we don't know.
Something I really resonated with what Krista just said is it seems like something that we really don't know is, and we're not very good at understanding, is the experiences of other people. There are things scientifically we can know in aggregate. A lot of science is about taking group averages or looking at like large-scale patterns. But it seems like trying to crack that nut of trying to understand, what is the experience of living in a low SES? Like you made this point about how we're all, in this room privileged and et cetera. To me, that's a different kind of knowing, or maybe it's not, but I at least wanted to raise that. Like, are there these different kinds of knowing, and are some kinds of knowing more difficult than others? Like the knowing of what it's like to be a this person, you know? Like, is that a harder form of knowing than like what the scientific method does?
Yeah, well, it takes a different kind of investment, and it also takes a different investment of time
Yeah.
and a quality of time.
Or why is it easy to carry ideals from any background or philosophy or religion and then find ourselves challenged in a moment of dialogue, traumatized by an ability to even speak a kind of encouragement, like, okay, I disagree with what's being said here, but could we talk further? And let's find that ground that Rumi talked about, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right. The field in which we can converse, where we could talk. Why is it so hard? Why is it so challenging?
Maybe the question is what enables you to do that, the flip side.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you talk about millennials, I have a lot of them in my life, and they do seem more open. And I wonder if they carry something different inside that enables them to be out there more.
Well, the quote is, metaphor is a part of the not knowing aspect of art. And yet I'm firmly convinced that it is the supreme way of searching for truth. And then, of course, he asks the question, how can this be?
How can this be?
And I find so much wisdom in that from the science perspective and the spiritual perspective, that we've killed each other for centuries over essentially metaphors. We don't know. God is that, we don't know. It's just a pointer, but we kill for these metaphors and stories. And in science, when you didn't know, there was often a metaphor for it. The lab I worked in to put my way through college for years was called circadian rhythms, and we were looking for the biological clock. Now, clock, that's a metaphor. So in thinking, when I put this in, I thought about this, and I emailed the director of the lab. I said, Mike, are they still using this clock metaphor? He said, well, there's a big argument about whether we should still, because we've learned so much. I still think it's useful, but I've changed to clocks.
Nice.
So the metaphor has
That's
evolved
nice.
to clocks. And his mentor, Pittendrigg, the last conversation I had with Pittendrigg, Pittendrigg said, we should just drop this clocks metaphor and think of something else, because this is not what we've discovered enough in the 40 years' time. So it seems to me that science, the unknown is usually, there's a shorthand metaphor for the unknown. Then when they find it, it turns into math. Eventually, the unknown goes from a metaphor to an idea, like a hypothesis or a theorem, to math, ultimately. But you start with a metaphor for the unknown. And if we held our religious metaphors lightly, we wouldn't be hitting each other over the head for the sake of a metaphor, because it's just a pointer for the unknown. And poetry is all a search for truth. It's the not knowing aspect. We don't know this truth we feel when we touch that background hum or whatever it is. But there's a metaphor that just opens it up for a moment. But we don't land in the metaphor and say, hey, I've discovered clock. Clock it is.
And this is the final connection.
And that's the
It's an
final it,
opening
and nothing
connection.
more to be said. And don't change the scripture one whit. And. So anyway, that's why I chose this.
I've been reading some of the research on metaphors, and it fits the two things you characterize, that it is a way of searching for the truth, but it is also a sign of unknowing. And the metaphor is usually a much more concrete, which is itself a metaphor, a concrete version of something abstract, that when you are trying to articulate something that's at a higher, more complex level, you fall back on very simple physical things to do it. And it's interesting, even like metaphors about the self have changed over the centuries as physical processes have come up. So the pressure cooker idea of the id, was popular in the steam era of Freud and so forth. And then the brain as a computer is a more recent one. But again, it's always using something simple and physical as an analogy, but it's an analogy to sort of get you by, to talk about things you don't fully understand. And the scientific ideal, I guess, would be to progress where you can characterize it accurately without needing the metaphors.
I don't put myself in this category, but there's many very smart religious people who would say, if you're going to reduce religious language to metaphor, then you've sort of lost it. They were like the language of symbol. You're using symbolic language because in the logic of how they describe language working, a symbol participates in the truth of the reality that it's trying to grasp. So there's a claim about the truth anchor on the other side of it, even though it's not complete. So I just didn't want the realm of truth to sort of think about religion and science as truth is over here, and the unknown, the shifting is over here. I think both of them are in both places.
It strikes me that there's this whole dimension of science and religion that we haven't really tapped into yet in terms of the exceptional imagination in the room. And I don't know if this will be helpful, but sort of Marty charged us with a 500-year idea, and I'm wondering if I can invite people to charge the scientists in the room with questions that are testable to some extent, because I think that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom and technology, spiritual technology and rituals and practices and values and concepts and community and symbols and scripture and all of these things. So it's sort of an avenue that I offer for exploration of this whole other dimension of spirituality and religion, and its relationship with science and psychology specifically in terms of this rich, fertile ground. And I think there's this road of beliefs that we can go up and down, but we might be missing out on these rich pastures of spiritual imagination that I feel like maybe selfishly as psychologists we could benefit tremendously from. And I hope, maybe as scientists we can speak to some of the data, which I think is really quite striking, of how much religion and spirituality is capable of promoting well-being.
That's wonderful for us to move in that direction, but I think if you take beliefs and you set them aside, it makes the beliefs look as if they're not themselves practices. So having a discussion about the true status of the reality of God is so central to, it is the central practice. It's not sort of like you can set the idea over here and then look at what's going on, because when you're praying, that you believe you're praying to a God who exists as a truth claim is what makes the prayer happen.
I'm not trying to say that beliefs are irrelevant by any stretch. I think they're profound and a crucial part, but I wonder if they're everything.
I think you step away from belief to practice and structure. Harold Schulweis, who was a very great rabbi in the Los Angeles area, I remember saying at one point that prayer is really speaking to oneself, for example. And you get away from the God notion, for example. I had suggested, I think in one of the things I wrote, that one question you all might measure is to what extent keeping kosher promotes grit. Okay? You're telling a kid you can eat this, but not that. If you eat meat, you have to wait 6 hours before you can have ice cream. You're developing certain habits and ways of doing things. Does that promote grit? Is that a question that a scientist can answer? Gratitude. Okay. Blessings upon arising. This is what a Jew is supposed to say every day. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, ruler of time and space, who enables us to distinguish day from night, who made me in the divine image, who made me a Jew, who made me free, who gives sight to the blind, who clothes the naked, who releases the bound, who straightens those who are bent down, who stretches out the dry earth over the waters, who has provided for all my needs, who steadies our steps, who strengthens the people Israel with courage, who crowns the people Israel with glory, who gives strength to the weary. Okay? Do those expressions of gratitude said every day, and there are other examples, and the blessings that you say when, before eating a meal, and Christians have their versions of it as well. Do those expressions of gratitude generate feelings of well-being? You set up, and Darren, is working on positive psychology in Judaism, presumably because the practices and things that are done generate well-being, generate permit, all of that.
I'd be curious to know what rituals can be ascribed a certain meaning to anticipate life's condition, so that as religious leaders, we can know, and we do know, the different stages of life that people go through. But if we had a science insight as to what are the best tools to be able to deploy for a person when they're faced with a liminal moment, that we could be most helpful to them, so that they didn't have to go through what my grandparents went through, which was they just shut the world down. They didn't have access to a Jewish community. They didn't have access. They didn't take advantage of the rabbi that was in their neighborhood. But that's an important social structure, social institution, to be able to help people at those most liminal moments in their lives, because that's what, in some way, the institution of religion is set up to provide.
I think we want to go around the room to speak to the issue of 500-year idea, what we learned, something we particularly remember from our 3 days with each other.
The number one thing I came with a vague idea about, and I'm quite certain now, is that we need to let go as individuals. We need to let go of trying to control things, of trying to control things in our life and other people, our children, our spouse, that we need to sort of make our boundaries permeable, as we were talking about. So if we have this kind of space where we allow people and the universe in, I think that that's the place where we can become imaginative, because we'll meet other people instead of forcing our own way through. But I think that there are conditions. So I think for a start, we need to go in with an unconditional love, grace for other people. Because I think religion and spirituality is individual. I don't think that one piece fits everybody. And I think that when we come out the other side, I think it's really important to have, we need to have people believe that they matter going in. But when they come out, I think it's important that people feel respected and not judged.
In terms of the big idea, I don't know yet how to disseminate the idea of love into the world in terms of people understanding it in the same way. What I hear my son tell me all the time, I say, well, Emmett, here's how I would like you to do it. He said, Dad, that might be your truth, but that's not my truth. And I think that's telling in some way about truth. And so I don't think that's the big 500-year idea. I don't think it's trying to find common ground around truth. But I would like to put out the idea of heart and mind, because it gives two different access places for people, some who might be more cerebral, some who might be more on the feeling end. I think they're good symbols. I think they're physical symbols. I think we can speak to those images and people understand that there's a wisdom aspect that you can learn, and there is an experiential thing that you can discover. And I think both can happen in the mind and the heart. While the big 500-year idea may have been right for how time worked over the past 2,000-3,000 years, with the acceleration and speed of time and how fast things change, I wonder if it's a 50-year idea that we should be shooting for, not necessarily a 500 one.
The truth is that the science-religion clash, I think, is mostly artificial. It's actually it's not global, it's only a Christian thing, and it's only parts of Christianity. And it's very new. It's a couple hundred years old, and it wasn't there in the classic scientists. Darwin was not the first scientist to break with religion. He was the last scientist in that tradition, and he was so aware of what he was working with. The science-religion clash is not true to the history of science or the history of religion, and I think what we have now is a correction, a new conversation. If we had more days, one thing I realized very late in the day here is that when I'm talking about beliefs, I'm not talking about things like Moroni and even whether God exists. I'm talking about beliefs about how you live a good life and whether it matters. I'm talking about precisely the kinds of things you guys are studying to say, in fact, that is not only true as a piece of moral imagination, it lowers your blood pressure. So to me, this science, religion, bringing the genius from both of our traditions and both of our disciplines can precisely be the catalyst for this to truly be a revolutionary age where we live into, if you think about the axial age as the beginnings of human moral consciousness, perhaps we now receive the tools to think and act as a species to grow up into that.
The one takeaway I know will stay with me, and I'm trying to knit it into the context of love and knowing that you matter, or being validated, all that, is a story, I may be paraphrasing, a story that you tell about the future creates your present. And the whole notion that one's current well-being is a function about how we think about the future. And that, to me, is the one takeaway and is a common denominator to much of what I've heard over the last couple days.
Well, I've been feeling somewhat despondent about the 21st century for a little while now, and hearing your voices in this amazing place has been very crucial, like a sense of gravity regained. I'm hearing truth in everybody's voice. I'm hearing encouragement in fields I may not have studied for a long time, and I want to study again and with fervor. Last year, the favorite word I learned was in Japan. It was from a student in a poetry class at Yokohama International School, and it's yutori, and Chika and I were just talking about that word, and she wrote to me that it meant life space. It meant always arriving early so you didn't have to rush. It meant giving yourself room to make a mistake, giving yourself room to become interested in something you never thought you were interested in, and then following up on that. And she gave other descriptions too, but then she ended by saying, today I realize that poetry gives me the most life space of any form of literature, because I'm able to look at what other people have lived, stand back from it, kind of take it into my larger being, my place of belief and perspective, and think about it and go back to it, read it over and over again, which to me has always been one of the joys of poetry, is that it's portable enough to experience in repetition, as a prayer is, or as a chant is. So this yutori became very, very important. And here we are in one of the world's great spaces that so many people have seen images of, but don't have a chance to physically be in. And I feel very lucky that we had these conversations in this physical space. And I hope all of us will be able to continue to encourage openness in every realm we're in, whether it's comfortable or not.
I have a friend who's a very emotional CEO. I mean, when he talks about America, he cries. When he talks about his mother and brother, he cries. When he often talks about his company, he cries. And so he wrote a book, which was How to Lead from Your Heart. And like anyone who's written the book, he's out promoting. And so he gets a special audience at Google at one of their noonday meetings where all of the kids come around and he speaks and he talks about his book and leading by the heart and so forth. And one young woman raised her hand and she introduced herself. I'm a PhD in mathematics. And I just have one question for you, sir. Where do I go to learn how to be led by my heart? And it seems to me that what we're saying here is be led by your heart. At the same time, the story of Winston Churchill loses the election, wins the war, wins World War II. And in the first year out, he loses the election. So he goes to the House of Commons, it's a farewell speech, and he makes the following speech, and this is the speech in total. He says, success is never final. Defeat is never fatal. Only courage counts. And so I think the key thing here is to have courage to be led, to lead by the heart.
I don't know that there's a new 500-year idea, but I think there may be new 500-year practices. So I would want to find the future in the practices, in new practices that then could be studied. But the great religions have lasted all these years because they have come up with practices that have practical effects in the world. And for the first time, and you're largely to blame for this, Marty, social scientists are taking these seriously enough to study. And then we'll feed back, and again, it's this dialogue, we'll feed back these practices in scientific language, which is more neutral than our individual stories.
There's been this paradigm shift in the past couple of years in cognitive neuroscience in particular from this focus on what's called the executive attention network, which is the focus on the outside world and the concentration on the impersonal, to understanding the inner world and the personal. Again, I guess one could say a shift from the objective to the subjective, using the objective methodologies to understand the subjective. And in lots of ways, I see great potential in doing that. Abraham Maslow had this this quote that I'd be remiss if I didn't quote Abraham Maslow, as I always do. The more that we plumb the depths of ourselves, the more we understand humanity. I fully believe this to be the case. And I would love to see how we can use the scientific method to draw out and capture more of the inner truths in a way to show everyone how they are generalizable truths. And I think it's going to be through that process that we increase love and understanding and tolerance. We kind of bring out as strongly as possible and magnify the common humanness of our inner experiences. And I think that's been a big goal of what imagination is and understanding inner experiences.